love Greece, and I read ancient Greek and Latin at university, and then, of course, proceeded to go into a career that had absolutely nothing to do with those. Well, what it has enabled me to do is to be incredibly annoying and pedantic about spelling and grammar. And also, at least, when we're on holiday with the family, I can read some of the signs in Greek. But I have to say, I never imagined that my student self, my grown-up self, would actually be able to find some sort of accommodation. And I'll explain what I mean by that, I hope, over the next few minutes. I'll also explain what I mean by including this gentleman here, whom I'm sure you recognize, but this is Pericles. And Pericles was one of the earliest and most successful democratic leaders in ancient Greece. Now, it's very difficult to find a sculpture or a statue of Pericles without this helmet on. And actually, this helmet was a symbol of his position, but actually, the rumor was it was because he had a really weird-shaped head. But nevertheless, it was a very strong branded look. So I suppose you could say that about it too. But actually, on a more serious note, what was interesting about ancient Greek democracy was, of course, it was a direct democracy. People expected to get involved in a whole range of issues. It wasn't just about one vote every few years and representing people for that time. So maybe there are some interesting parallels for our conversations and our democracy today. But when it comes to that democracy, at the moment, democracy, I guess, has a bit of a bad rap, a bit of a bad reputation. Whether or not that's about wars, whether or not it's its failure to tackle issues like climate change, whether or not it's attached to democracies and the difficulty of getting people to vote for pain rather than pleasure at the moment. I guess what we all want is for democracy really to succeed, because that, I think we'd all believe, is the way to get people to live healthier, happier, more productive, safer lives. Now, what good branding does is it does manage to connect with people, to touch people on their daily lives. And I know what you might say is, buying a household brand is not exactly the same as voting for someone who's going to represent your life. It's on a rather different level. However, because brands do manage to touch people across boundaries, and by the way, I'm talking about brands that can be in any sector. It can be retail, it can be corporate, it can be product, it can, of course, be not-for-profit. And often when people talk about brands, they can forget that some of the world's most powerful brands, most influential brands, are in the not-for-profit sector. Because when I talk about brands, I'm not just talking about the top bit, the logo. I mean, frankly, a week doesn't go past before you see silly headlines about, this company has been renamed and it costs £50 million. And frankly, if any of those amounts had been true, I'd have retired to the Caribbean a long time ago. But it's so easy for people to get distracted by the top bit of branding, the name and the logo and the packaging and everything else. And I have to say that working sometimes with political parties, when you talk about rebranding, what they really mean is, could you give us a new squiggle and could you give us a new slogan? Whereas, of course, what makes good brands really work is the substance that lies beneath, the shared vision. And the minute you start talking about that substance and shared vision, you might start thinking about some issues with democracy. Is there a shared vision for democracy? And certainly from what I've seen so far, maybe there isn't. Now, if branding has got some challenges, then democracy has too. And just on the challenges for branding, I talked about some headlines, but also this book, for example, became a bestseller. And what I'd like to say, and it was interesting that The Economist ran this front cover in retort to some of the books that have been written on this subject. It was basically talking about ProLogo, that actually branding is a very successful, sustainable engine for economies. And what's more, sometimes people underestimate this, if you've got a strong brand, you've got a loyal customer. If you've got a loyal customer, that means more security of earnings, more security of income, and actually more security of employment. And that in itself is quite an important issue. And what's more, a strongly branded organization has got a reputation to protect, so they're likely to try and do the right thing. However, I guess the thing that you would also say is that in today's digital age, unless you are doing the right thing, unless you are who you say you are and you do what you say you're going to do, you'll get found out with a speed and a scale that will take your breath away. And the same with political parties and also political leaders. So absolutely beware. Now, there are some learnings, in my view, because brands can connect with people, get them to vote for people every day, either in their purchases or their influence. I just want to use an example of that. What was so interesting in some of the latest elections in Greece or in France is, again, how difficult it is to get for people to vote for difficult things. And the temptation so often in politics and amongst parties is to do the equivalent of bog off. Have you heard of bog off? Buy one, get one free. So coming up to elections, and what political parties start saying is, retire at 50? Absolutely, we'll have that supermarket special offer. You want to, get a full pension, etc. Absolutely, we'll do that. So politicians privately say, oh my goodness, we know that we're promising things that we can't deliver and can't afford to deliver, but we do need to get voted in. It's a very compromising thing. And what's more, when they can't deliver at a later date, that makes people rather cynical and not supportive of politics. So the temptation to make promises you can't keep. Not a great commercial, often, for democracy. Now, I'm just going to talk briefly about this very strong brand here. Apple hardly ever discounts, it doesn't do deals, it's very engaging with its consumers, and with apologies to a previous speaker, it does have a strong vision. It talks about, man shall not be subordinate to machine. And it's easy to be cynical about this kind of stuff, and actually in the UK sometimes we've elevated cynicism to a fine art. On the other hand, it really does connect with people. It really has engaged with people. And what's more, of course, Apple had a leader who enthralled enough consumers to vote for Apple to make it the world's most valuable company. And that's despite the fact that it's incredibly expensive, relatively speaking. It occasionally makes mistakes, and whisper it, occasionally it can be a little bit arrogant. So, I don't think that we'd say that Apple employees felt that it was particularly democratic. But what we would say, though, if you just looked in a marketplace at what's happening here, so you look at these declines, even if there was a little blip at the end of some of these graphs, and you would say, you need a bit of innovation, you need some radical strategic input, you need some new brands, for goodness sake. And again, these are the numbers of people who are not voting. This is the decline in numbers of voters just across the UK and across the USA. So clearly we need to do something. No wonder people are disengaged. Because, of course, you can only vote for people every few years. You can't make your views felt. You can't make your views count in a democratic process more often than that. And that, again, compared with what you can do in the commercial space these days, you can shape brands. You can make your views felt. You can really, really make some changes. And yet, actually, in politics, in democracy, it's really quite difficult to do that. So we need some innovation, and we need to send these graphs, in my view, in the opposite direction. If you can compare the shape of these with, for example, what happens with strongly branded businesses over time, and just see how strongly well-branded businesses outperform the average of others. And I guess that we could do with a little bit of movement in this way in democracy itself, and the take-up of democracy as well. Because if you were to look at those previous charts, you'd say, actually, there's a problem here. The management's pretty rubbish and not doing a great job. And again, we need to break out and do something very different. So are there some lessons that we could learn from branding to democracy that doesn't involve a spanky new logo or indeed a new slogan? And if you were to take the top 100 brands, and we've looked at them for about the last 15 years, there are 3 key characteristics that come up time after time in what makes a strong brand, and that might be very good as a comparator with democracy. And the first one is about clarity. Clarity of what the brand stands for, how it's different from the competitors. And of course, right now, you look at democracy and say, is it very clear? Is it very clear what we mean by democracy? Is that a shared vision? I mean, half of the world live in some sort of democracy. Only 11% live in a full democracy. But of course, there are different ways of doing that full democracy, either forced or otherwise voluntary, and many, many different points of view about how to engage. Now, if you were going to be creating a global brand, and take some lessons from there, you'd actually bother to ask the people who really mattered, like your customers, your consumers. How about asking people around the world? Because at the moment, what happens with democracies is that they almost act like export brands. And of course, if you've got an American export brand or a Western European export brand, that might not go down very well the way it's done in other parts of the world. So if you wanted to create a global brand, you'd start with a global perspective. You might get some experts from around the world, possibly not politicians, who would come together and think about what are the best practices and evidence base to the best practice for how you absolutely deliver democracy in a way that was most likely to deliver the healthiest, wealthiest, and safest societies. So clarity and consistency. If you just think about consistency in a political context, and you would say, actually, a lot of political parties, for example, they're not executed consistently. What about coherence in policies? This currently doesn't work as well as it might do. And of course, the final characteristic of a very successful brand is about leadership. And leadership is obviously about who runs the organization, who symbolizes the organization, as of course it can apply both to commercial and also to political parties. But it also means restlessness, it means innovation, it means setting the agenda in markets. And maybe that isn't always done in, if I can call it, the political market too. When one thinks about leadership, and RIP Steve Jobs, but what he did do, though, he absolutely symbolized all the best characteristics of the Apple brand, and I wonder how it will survive and thrive after he has gone. And then when one thinks about the political world, obviously there are some political leaders who've been rather more successful than others, and rather more successful people at persuading that through the pain there will be some pleasure at the end of it, and that it's worth absolutely sticking through that. But just back to Pericles and back to ancient Greece. Again, coming back to direct democracy, ways of getting people involved in the political process on a much more active level. This has to be absolutely the way forward. And it would be great, I've shared some ideas for maybe how to use the principles of branding to engage people in democracy, and I'd be fascinated with your ideas too. And thank you to Greece and thank you to Pericles for the inspiration. Many thanks for listening.